The roar of the engines was deafening as the cramped ship swayed across the Atlantic. The German POWs were crammed into the hold like cattle, their faces gaunt from months of captivity, their hands bound, their minds clouded with the uncertainty of what awaited them on the other side. The war had already taken everything: comrades, families, homes, and now, they were prisoners in the hands of an enemy they had been taught to despise. It seemed unreal. They had been told they were being transported to a prisoner camp in the United States, a place of internment where they would live out the final days of the war. But nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to witness. The ship, which had once felt like a lifeline between their miserable existence in Germany and the unknown, now felt like a coffin, a floating metal box carrying men who had already seen the world's worst. They were numb to fear, numb to death. But nothing could numb them for what was coming. As the days dragged on, rumors spread like wildfire among the men, whispers about the size of the American camps, the mystery of American culture, and the strange power they had only heard of in hushed voices. The ship's rough wooden beams creaked under the weight of their hopes and fears. One thing was clear: they weren't going to a camp like the ones in Europe. The vastness of America was a mystery to them, something they had never truly understood. After all, America was just an abstraction, a land of Hollywood films, far-off stories, and headlines, too distant to feel real. When they finally docked in the United States in late 1944, the transformation was immediate. As the ship pulled into the harbor, the men had their first look at the land that had been their enemy. The coastline of the United States sprawled out before them, far more vast and structured than they could have imagined. It was a country that felt alive with movement, with energy, and with purpose. Nothing like the broken, bomb-ravaged streets they had left behind in Europe. "What is this?" one of the men whispered, wide-eyed. He had been raised on the belief that America was a land of chaos, ruled by entertainment and indulgence. But here, they were looking at something completely different, an industrial beast, a nation that could produce more than just weapons. It could produce the very life that kept its military going. The ship docked with a thud, and the men were marched off, their tired eyes scanning their new surroundings. The port was bustling with activity, ships unloading, workers moving with precision, machinery clanking. The scale of everything was something they couldn't begin to grasp. It wasn't just the size, it was the speed. They had never seen anything like this in their homeland. The men were used to seeing trains and trucks laboriously transport goods, always with a sense of struggle and effort. But here, everything seemed effortless. Goods moved smoothly, as if the system had been designed for one thing: efficiency. The Germans were herded onto buses, long, sleek American vehicles, and driven through the city. The streets stretched out before them in straight lines, a far cry from the haphazard, bombed-out streets of Berlin or Hamburg. The buildings were tall, some of them gleaming with glass windows. They couldn't believe it. How could a country that had suffered so many years of war be this vibrant, this full of life? As they were transported further into the country, they came across massive factories, huge structures with assembly lines running like clockwork. It wasn't just the factories themselves that shocked them, it was the magnitude of what they were seeing. Large, powerful machines, unlike anything they had ever imagined, hummed and moved in the factories. They couldn't fathom how all this machinery existed in one place. Even the industrial cities of Germany, with all their focus on production, couldn't match this scale. One POW later reflected that America seemed to be a land where machines were alive. It wasn't just the size of the factories that stunned them, it was the precision, the sheer efficiency of it all. The Germans had always prided themselves on their technical skill, their engineering. But here, in the United States, they saw a different kind of power, one of endless capacity, one that was far beyond what they had imagined. They were introduced to steel mills, car factories, and, unbelievably, factories that made planes and tanks faster than they could count. The myth of American disorganization, propagated through their wartime propaganda, felt like a lie. The Germans had been taught that Americans were inefficient and lazy, but what they saw now was the opposite. This country was a behemoth in motion, operating with a focus and speed they had never seen before. Each factory was like a heartbeat, pumping out machinery at a pace that made the German war effort look sluggish in comparison. In their brief moments of silence, the POWs reflected on the mistake they had made, thinking they were the superior force. America is a chaotic mess, they had been told for years. And yet, what they saw here was nothing short of perfection in production. They had been misled. They had been living in a bubble, with no idea of how powerful and organized the U.S. really was. It wasn't just that they were losing a war, it was that they were being outproduced, outmuscled, and outpaced by a force they had misunderstood entirely. It was then that the full weight of it hit them. The German war machine was built on the backs of men, limited by resources and the lingering damage of years of conflict. But in America, the factories never stopped. The machines never stopped. Steel was forged in unimaginable quantities, and vehicles were built at a pace that seemed to mock the German reliance on manual labor. "This is what they call America's might," one POW muttered in awe. "It's not about numbers. It's about machines." If they had known this, perhaps they would have never entered the war. If they had known the sheer scale of American industry, they might have realized their mistake earlier. But it was too late. They had no choice now but to observe in disbelief, as the very thing they thought they understood slipped beyond their reach. But here's the thing, if you turn away from this story, if you refuse to look at how these men were forced to confront their misconceptions about American power, you'll be just like them, too blind to see the full picture. This story isn't just about war, it's about understanding the power of industry, the power of machines, and how America's industrial might reshape the war. Don't be left behind in the dark. Stay with us, subscribe, and see how these men learned the true meaning of power, how America's industrial revolution changed the course of history. The next morning, the German POWs were shuffled off the buses, their eyes still clouded with confusion. They were no longer confined to a ship or even a prison camp, they had arrived at an industrial complex unlike anything they had ever imagined. As they walked through the gates of the factory, the true scale of what they were about to witness began to sink in. The first thing that struck them was the noise. The factory floors were alive with activity, machines clanking, metal grinding, and the sound of thousands of workers moving with a purpose. It was unlike the factory conditions in Germany, where everything moved with deliberate slowness, constrained by a lack of resources and manpower. Here, it was as if the machines themselves were in charge. Some of the POWs had been trained as engineers, and their eyes darted around the space with awe. They saw assembly lines stretching as far as the eye could see. There were no breaks, no pauses. The machines worked continuously, pouring out parts faster than any human hand could ever hope to. Every moment, new components were being assembled into vehicles, planes, and tanks. But it wasn't just the quantity, it was the speed. These machines were not built for efficiency, they were built for immensity. Each one seemed designed to outpace the next, a testament to America's overwhelming industrial power. As the POWs moved deeper into the factory, they came across an even more astounding sight, the production of tanks. It wasn't just the scale that shocked them, it was the sheer speed with which these massive machines were built. Tanks that in Germany would take weeks to assemble were put together here in just a matter of hours. The assembly line was a constant, rhythmic motion, with workers effortlessly moving parts, assembling components, and fitting them together like pieces in a puzzle. The Germans, who had once prided themselves on precision and craftsmanship, couldn't help but feel a deep sense of awe, and, eventually, dread. How can they make these so fast? One of the engineers muttered under his breath. His question was answered when an American worker, seeing the German's astonished face, stopped to explain, "Automation, my friend. It's what's powering this whole country." The POWs were assigned menial tasks for the day, mostly sweeping floors and moving crates, but that didn't stop them from peering into the heart of the factory. As they worked, they noticed a strange pattern: everything was connected. The efficiency was staggering. The supply chain for every piece of material, steel, rubber, plastic, was precise, flawless. And the American workers were not just efficient, they were consistent, moving in perfect synchronization. It was as if each person understood exactly how their work fit into the grand design of the factory. The Germans, who had seen their country's factories collapse under constant bombardment, realized the sheer immensity of what America had built, and how it had been built to last. But it wasn't just the factory that left the POWs stunned, it was the American attitude toward work. The men had always believed that Germans were the world's hardest workers. Their factories, while limited in scope, were run with military precision. But here, in the heart of the American industrial machine, they saw something they hadn't expected: joy in work. The workers smiled, joked with each other, and seemed genuinely proud of what they were doing. It was a sharp contrast to the grim, fatigued atmosphere of their own factories, where workers labored under the weight of defeat. Here, in America, there was a sense of hope, an almost unshakable belief in the power of production to change the course of war. The Germans had been taught that hard work and sacrifice were the only paths to victory. But the Americans had built something else entirely, something driven not just by effort, but by optimism and unrelenting drive. One of the younger German pilots, still reeling from the shock of the American speed, stood by an open window and stared out at the sprawling industrial complex. For the first time, he wondered what it would have been like if Germany had this kind of industry. If they had access to this level of manufacturing power, would the war have been different? He thought back to his training, to the dogfights, to the pride he had felt when he flew his plane. But now, in the face of what he was seeing, it felt hollow. The machinery of war, of truly endless production, had already taken its place. No single pilot, no single man, could win a war built on this scale. But the question that gnawed at them was simple: how had America done it? The German prisoners were used to seeing weapons forged in desperation, crafted by hand or with limited resources. Their own factories were straining to produce what little they could with the remnants of their war economy. But here, in America, it was different. They had seen nothing like it. A single tank rolling off the assembly line was worth more than the entire factory the Germans had built in years. And it wasn't just one tank, it was thousands, millions, a constant stream that never stopped, feeding into the American war machine. How could a country do this so efficiently, so effectively, and keep it going through the longest, most brutal war in history? One POW, a mechanic by trade, finally turned to his fellow prisoners and spoke the truth that hung in the air between them all: they have no limits. The others nodded silently. They knew, deep down, that this wasn't just a battle of soldiers on the ground or in the sky. This was a war of manufacturing power. And America had unlimited production. The German machine could build a fighter plane, a tank, a weapon, but America could build 100 in the time it took for the Germans to build one. It wasn't just that America had more, it was that America had more in ways that Germany could never match. The scale of it, the efficiency of it, it was almost overwhelming. And for the first time, the prisoners realized they weren't just fighting a war of ideologies or soldiers, they were fighting an industrial juggernaut that couldn't be stopped. If you think you can turn away from this story, from the overwhelming realization of just how far ahead America was in industrial might, you're missing the core of what this war was really about. The technology gap, the sheer industrial power, was more than just a difference in factories. It was a difference in mindset, in strategy, and in economic strength. Don't miss out on how it all changed. Stay with us, subscribe, and learn the true power behind America's industrial might. Because if you don't, you'll never truly understand how it reshaped the future of the world. As the days turned into weeks, the German POWs began to grasp the scope of what they had walked into. The factory wasn't just an isolated location, it was a single piece of an intricate, enormous network that powered the entire country. Every factory, every assembly line, every warehouse they saw was part of a larger machine, a system working in perfect harmony. The workers, the engineers, the machines, they weren't just making tanks or planes, they were crafting an entire war effort, one that had been running smoothly for years, long before the Germans had even set foot on American soil. It was the machines that dominated everything now. The German engineers, who had once been proud of their own factories back home, found themselves humbled by the precision of the American way. Here, the tools were sharp, the production lines endless, and the processes so automated they seemed like something out of a dream. Every machine had its purpose. No tool ever went idle, no part ever went unmade. A group of German prisoners were assigned to help with basic tasks, moving parts, cleaning floors, and other menial labor. But even in their lowly position, they couldn't stop looking at the machines around them. Everything in this country was made by machine, and everything worked like clockwork. The vast factories seemed alive, pulsating with the hum of technology. The prisoners had never seen anything like it in Germany. While their own country was filled with industrial ruins, America seemed to be powered by an endless series of mechanical hands, moving in unison to feed the war machine. The men had been used to working with machines in their own factories, but here, it was different. In Germany, factories were clunky, filled with outdated technology. Workers were often overworked, struggling to meet quotas. But in America, it was as if every part of the machine was designed to work together seamlessly. One German POW, a machinist by trade, watched in disbelief as pieces of tanks were assembled in minutes, not weeks. "How can they do this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. He wasn't the only one asking that question. Every man around him wondered the same thing. America's industrial system was a living, breathing thing, and it was all about mass production. The POWs were exposed to it all. Automobile factories, military factories, weapons factories, the scale of everything was beyond comprehension. As they passed through these enormous plants, they could see the American workers, moving effortlessly from station to station. The assembly lines ran like a well-oiled machine, each part of the production process was perfect, precise. Parts were passed from one worker to another, each man doing his job with unmatched speed. The Germans had seen assembly lines before, but nothing like this. What they saw here was the industrial heart of America, a machine so vast, so powerful, it could fuel an entire nation's war effort. One of the POWs, a seasoned engineer who had worked on Germany's jet engine projects, stood frozen in front of a massive assembly line that produced American bombers. He had never seen anything like it. The efficiency, the speed, it was almost too much for him to process. He had always been proud of his work in Germany, believing the German engineering was the best in the world. But now, standing here, he realized the truth. America's machines weren't just fast, they were beyond anything Germany had ever built. The thought stung. It stung deep, like a bitter pill that refused to go down. The man, still standing there, watched a B-17 bomber take shape in minutes. The parts, once spread out across the factory floor, were now pieced together with such precision and speed that it seemed impossible. The American workers didn't seem to struggle. They didn't look tired. They just kept working, moving like a well-rehearsed dance. The engineer could hardly believe it. This is not just production. This is domination. The words echoed in his mind, but he couldn't shake the thought, if Germany had this kind of industry, they would have won the war. But it wasn't just about having the machines, it was about what you did with them. And the Americans had mastered that art. The POWs began to understand. The factories were not just machines, they were part of a system that never stopped, a cycle of productivity that couldn't be interrupted. The workers didn't simply produce weapons, they produced endless waves of them. Planes, tanks, jeeps, trucks, the assembly lines never paused. The Germans were used to rationing, to making do with what they could. But here, the United States had unlimited resources, materials, manpower, and, most importantly, machines. The machines didn't need food or sleep, they only needed raw materials to turn into the next weapon of war. A few of the German prisoners, who had once worked on factory floors in Germany, started asking the American workers questions. They wanted to know how they could produce so many planes, so many tanks, so many weapons. The Americans responded simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world: we've got the tools, and we've got the people who know how to use them. The German engineers, having heard that phrase over and over, began to realize that it wasn't just about tools or people, it was about the scale of it. America's industrial system didn't rely on one or two great factories, it was about a network of factories working together seamlessly. In the evenings, as they were escorted back to the barracks, the prisoners couldn't stop talking about what they had seen. "We couldn't have this. No country could," one of the POWs said. The others agreed, their faces a mixture of awe and bitterness. Their own factories were in ruin, their country exhausted from years of war. They had thought Germany was the industrial heart of Europe, but now they were confronted with the reality that America's industrial power was unmatched. And then, one evening, after hearing another story about the enormous American factories, one of the POWs, a seasoned fighter pilot, turned to his fellow prisoners and said, "If we had this kind of industry, if we had these machines, we would have won the war." The words lingered in the air. There was no denying it. The Germans had been defeated, not just by tactics, but by the machines of war that America had been churning out, day after day, with no end in sight. But the truth they didn't want to face hung in the air like a cloud. If they had understood America's industrial power sooner, if they had recognized the scale of it, they might have thought differently about the war. But it was too late now. The machines, the factories, and the seemingly unlimited production had sealed the fate of the war long before the first tank ever rolled off the American assembly line. The POWs understood now: America wasn't just winning the war, it was rewriting the rules of war itself. And here's where you come in. If you're turning away from this story, thinking it's just about factories or planes, you're missing the most critical part of the tale. America's industrial might wasn't just an advantage, it was the game-changer that turned the tide of war. The German POWs saw it firsthand, but you don't have to miss it. Subscribe now to understand how the power of machines shaped the war, and why it's a lesson that still matters today. As the weeks passed, the German POWs began to feel the full weight of what they had seen. The factories, the tanks, the planes, they were no longer just facts they had been taught in the abstract. Now, they were realities, ones they could touch, feel, and, more than anything, experience. The raw scale of it all began to sink into their bones. It wasn't just about numbers or weapons. It was about a way of life, one that had been running like an unstoppable machine long before the Germans had even realized the true power of America's industrial base. Each morning, the prisoners awoke to the sounds of a factory already alive with movement. The constant clanking of steel, the hum of assembly lines, the mechanical whir of production, it was as though the American industrial complex never rested. It wasn't just a nation at war, it was a nation built to produce. The Germans had been used to working under the pressure of wartime scarcity, rationing every ounce of steel and fuel. But here, it was different. Here, the machines seemed to work in endless cycles, each one feeding into the next. A seemingly infinite network of factories stretched across the land, each one supplying the next, with no end in sight. One evening, after another long day of labor, the POWs were given the rare opportunity to speak with an American worker who had spent his entire life in one of the largest factories they had seen. He described, almost casually, how the factory produced hundreds of bombers every week, how the supply chain stretched from coast to coast. The German engineers were stunned into silence. The factory floors they had seen seemed limitless, and the numbers, hundreds of thousands of units a year, were simply incomprehensible. Hundreds of thousands, one POW gasped. Is that even possible? The American worker nodded, shrugging as though it were the simplest thing in the world. Sure. The real trick is in the supply lines and automation. We have a network so vast, we don't run out of materials. And when we do, it's usually just a matter of moving them around until we're back on track. His words were calm, matter of fact. For the Germans, it was a revelation, a system that seemed to operate on a level far beyond their understanding. The following day, a small group of POWs was taken on a tour of an American weapons plant, where they saw tanks and jeeps being assembled at such speed that it felt like watching an impossible dance. The machines were constantly in motion, and the workers moved with a rhythm that felt almost mechanical, but unlike anything the Germans had ever seen. There were no pauses for repairs. No downtime for breaks. Everything was running in perfect synchrony, each factory part feeding into the next, creating a seamless production process that never stopped. The Germans couldn't help but feel the immense power of it all. It wasn't just that America had the materials, it was that America had the infrastructure to move those materials, refine them, and transform them into weapons at a pace and scale they had never imagined. A seasoned German mechanic, who had spent years working with engines in Germany, marveled at the ease with which the Americans assembled their vehicles. "How can they make these tanks so quickly?" he asked, watching an American worker lift a massive tank turret with ease. In Germany, it took months to assemble just one. The American worker smiled. "That's the power of automation and mass production. We don't just build the weapons, we build the process. The machines build the machines, and the factories keep the machines going." For the first time, the POWs realized what they had been missing all along. It wasn't just about having the right machines or the right people, it was about building a system that never stopped. The Germans had been slowly grinding away at their war effort, rationing every resource, but America had built a self-sustaining monster of industry that could keep producing endlessly. As they continued their tour of the plant, the POWs saw a massive new bomber, fresh off the assembly line. The massive machine gleamed in the fluorescent light, and its sleek design was so efficient that it seemed almost futuristic. The German pilots, who had seen their own planes fall apart due to lack of parts and resources, couldn't help but be awed. The bomber looked as though it could fly forever, and its production was a testament to the might of American engineering. "How long does it take to make one of these?" one POW asked, still stunned by the sight. The American worker smiled. "Not long. With the assembly line, we can produce one every 2 hours." The German pilot's eyes widened. 2 hours? You can make an entire plane in 2 hours? The worker nodded. "Yep. By the end of the week, we'll have hundreds of these ready to fly." The following days were spent in a haze of wonder and disbelief. The German POWs tried to wrap their minds around the scale of what they were seeing. Every factory, every part, every worker, it was all connected, running in perfect harmony, churning out machines of war at a rate they could never have imagined. The Germans had never seen anything like this before. Their own factories, when they weren't being bombed or running out of raw materials, couldn't compete with the efficiency of the American war machine. One POW, a seasoned engineer, looked around the factory and whispered, "We could never have built this." The words lingered in the air. They were defeated by the very thing they had never understood, the sheer scale of America's industrial power. The American machine wasn't just about quantity. It was about continuity, about the ability to keep going, no matter what. And that was something the Germans had never been able to match. That night, as the POWs sat in their barracks, the weight of it all finally settled on them. They had spent years fighting for military superiority, believing their engineering and weapons would carry them to victory. But what they had failed to realize was that war was not just about weapons, it was about the power to produce them. And that power, they now understood, was held by America. If you think you've seen the limits of industrial power, you haven't seen what's coming next. The German POWs learned the hard way that machines can win wars, and they had just witnessed the unfathomable might of America's war machine. The days bled into each other, each one indistinguishable from the last, as the German POWs continued their laborious work in the American factories. They had been used to war, used to the harsh realities of combat and survival. But this was something entirely different. The factories were no longer just places of work for them, they had become symbols of something far more terrifying. The American industrial might wasn't just about machinery or production lines, it was about an endless cycle of creation, one that never stopped. Each morning, as they entered the factories, the sound of machines running at full throttle greeted them like a chorus. The Americans never stopped. The engines never stopped. The factories never stopped. The German POWs, already fatigued from months of captivity, began to feel the weight of their realization. The war wasn't just being fought with tanks and planes, it was being fought with the machines that could produce these weapons at a scale they had never seen before. America was outproducing them at an unimaginable rate. One afternoon, the prisoners were shown a massive bomber assembly line. The factory floor stretched as far as the eye could see, with rows of assembly lines all working simultaneously. There were no pauses, no lulls in production. The machines worked continuously, pouring out aircraft in perfect synchronization. It was as though the entire factory was alive, pulsing with a relentless rhythm. A senior German engineer watched in disbelief as workers assembled the B-24 bombers. Planes that had once been a distant dream in the minds of the German military. They had heard of these bombers but had never truly understood the scale of their production. He observed the American workers moving seamlessly from one task to the next, assembling parts with precision, and the planes taking shape almost magically before his eyes. "How long does it take to make one of these?" he asked a nearby American worker, his voice trembling with awe. The worker, without missing a beat, replied, "About 3 hours." The German engineer's heart sank. 3 hours. In Germany, it took weeks, sometimes months, to assemble a bomber, and even then, it was rushed, inefficient, and fraught with mistakes. Here, they were making these machines in a fraction of the time. And they weren't just making one, they were making hundreds, thousands, at the same time. Later that day, another POW, a young pilot who had once felt pride in his skill, wandered the factory floor in a daze. He had seen these machines at work, but now he saw the full force of their power. It was overwhelming. The assembly line stretched into the horizon, a sea of machines and men working tirelessly to build weapons of war. He thought back to the few planes they had managed to produce in Germany, the tired engines, the flawed designs. And now, here, in America, there was no flaw. No shortage of parts. No long delays. Every machine was in perfect working condition, every tool had its place, every worker had his role. It was precision taken to an extraordinary level. The young pilot, overwhelmed by the enormity of it all, finally spoke aloud, "We never had this. We could never have this." His words carried a sense of finality. The German machines were always on the verge of breaking, the factories always on the brink of collapse. But here, in the United States, the factories never stopped. The machines never stopped. And the planes? The planes didn't just come off the line, they came off in massive numbers. As the weeks went on, the POWs were exposed to more of America's endless production capabilities. One day, they were taken to a factory that produced tanks, the famed Sherman tanks that had already begun to appear on the front lines of battle. The tanks rolled off the assembly line one after another, as fast as the machines could make them. The workers didn't just assemble parts, they built the war. And it wasn't just tanks, it was every kind of vehicle. The German POWs, who had fought in the fields with their own limited supplies, watched in stunned silence as the Sherman tanks were assembled with ease. They were produced like clockwork, and in that moment, the Germans began to understand something terrifying: they were fighting an enemy who had built the war machine to outlast theirs. The American factories weren't just producing tanks and planes, they were producing the lifeblood of war itself, and they were doing it at a scale that no one could keep up with. One evening, as the German engineers sat around their barracks, they spoke in hushed voices about what they had seen. The factories, the machines, the assembly lines, everything seemed so alien, so beyond what they had ever thought possible. "I don't understand," one of the older engineers said, his voice trembling. "How did they do this? How could they build such machines, and at such a speed?" He shook his head, unable to comprehend the scale of what he had witnessed. In Germany, we worked day and night, but we could never match this. We were always scraping together whatever we could. Another engineer nodded gravely. America isn't just outbuilding us. They're outproducing us. They're producing at a level we couldn't even dream of. The POWs began to see the truth clearly now. The American power wasn't just about military tactics. It wasn't about the ability to fight. It was about the endless power of production. Every tank, every plane, every jeep, they weren't just fighting for victory. They were fighting to outproduce their enemies at a scale that couldn't be matched. And then, the most shocking realization hit them: this is why America had won. The German war machine had been impressive, efficient, and deadly. But it had always been limited by one thing: resources. The Americans, on the other hand, had endless resources, and they were using them to create the war effort in a way that Germany could never match. The German prisoners knew this was the end. It wasn't just the planes or the tanks, it was the machinery behind them. The fact that America's industrial might never stop gave them an unshakable advantage. And the Germans were simply too late to catch up. And here's the truth: if you think you can turn away from this story, if you refuse to understand the overwhelming force of American industry, you'll never understand the true nature of the war. Machines won this war. The endless power of production didn't just win battles, it changed the very course of history. Stay with us. Subscribe now, and learn why the industrial might of America was the ultimate weapon that changed everything. The German POWs were no strangers to the toll that war could take. They had seen destruction on a scale few could comprehend. But nothing they had ever witnessed prepared them for the true scope of America's industrial power. Every day, they worked in the factories, handling the most basic of tasks: sweeping floors, moving parts, and sorting materials, but in their idle moments, they couldn't help but look around in awe. The factories they worked in weren't just places of labor, they were living, breathing entities, constantly in motion. The machines moved at a pace that left them breathless, and the workers operated with a precision that seemed unnatural. One day, an engineer named Klaus, a veteran of the Luftwaffe and the German Engineering Corps, sat in a quiet corner of the factory, his eyes scanning the endless rows of machines and workers. It was impossible to look away. For weeks, he had watched as the Americans moved in a way that was completely foreign to him. Everything about their factories was different. There was no confusion, no waste of time. The parts they assembled, whether for tanks, planes, or bombs, fit together as though they were designed by the same hand. Seamless. Perfect. How do they do this? Klaus whispered to himself. He had been an engineer in Germany, part of the team that designed and built many of their aircraft, including the famed Me-262 jet. But here, in America, he was confronted by a system that didn't need genius to work, it just worked. America didn't just have better machines, it had better systems. The sheer speed and scale of it were incomprehensible. Klaus's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a nearby worker's voice. The man, an American named Charlie, smiled as he tightened a bolt on a massive tank turret. "You're staring at that machine like it's going to bite you," Charlie joked, noticing Klaus's dazed look. "I can't believe what I'm seeing," Klaus admitted, his voice tinged with awe. "Back in Germany, we struggled to produce a fraction of what you're making here. These tanks, these planes. I don't understand how you can do it." Charlie leaned back for a moment, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "It's not magic. It's just the way we do things here. We don't just build machines, we build processes." Klaus frowned, trying to grasp the meaning behind the words. Processes? Yeah, it's all about the system. We have factories making parts, then we have machines assembling those parts, then we ship them out. Every part of the process is connected. That's why it works. Klaus shook his head, a deep frustration mounting inside him. "In Germany, we made everything by hand. Every part. Every engine. It took us months. Sometimes years. But here, you build everything so quickly, and it's flawless. How? Charlie smiled again. You're looking at it the wrong way, my friend. We don't build things fast because we're better than you. We build things fast because we've spent years making sure every step of the process is perfect. And now, we've got factories producing everything we need, at the scale the world's never seen. Klaus stood up straight, his eyes scanning the endless rows of machines. The truth was becoming clear in a way he had not wanted to face. America wasn't just winning the war on the battlefield, they were winning it with their machines. The tanks and planes the Germans had built, the weapons they had fought so hard to produce, were nothing compared to the output of America's factories. In the weeks that followed, the German POWs found themselves increasingly aware of the insurmountable advantage America held over them. Their minds, once focused on survival, now struggled to comprehend the vastness of what they had witnessed. Klaus, along with several others, had begun to understand that it wasn't just the war effort that America had mastered, it was the art of production itself. Klaus spent hours on the factory floor, watching the assembly lines, speaking to workers when he could. He spoke to men who had worked in factories for years, building machines and parts with an ease that baffled him. He began to see the subtle ways that American workers had mastered not just their tools but the systems that allowed those tools to work in perfect unison. It was a machine in and of itself, the process, the coordination, and the unwavering consistency that came with America's industrial power. What had taken Germany years to perfect, America had mastered in months. It wasn't just about speed, it was about creating a system that never stopped, a cycle of continuous production that could fuel an entire war effort without pause. The realization dawned on Klaus and his fellow engineers: they had been outproduced, and that meant that, despite the strength of the German war machine, they were destined to lose. America's industrial power wasn't just about having more weapons, it was about being able to produce infinite numbers of them. The Zeros, the tanks, the bombers, their production had been constrained by time, by resources, by a war-torn economy. But America's factories had been built to run continuously, and they never stopped. As the months wore on, the men began to adapt in subtle ways. They understood now that the war wasn't just about strength or strategy, it was about the capacity to produce, and America's capacity was limitless. They were shown, for the first time, an American supply depot, filled with crates upon crates of tanks, weapons, and ammunition. It felt like endless rows of power, waiting to be sent to the front lines. A seasoned German officer stood beside the depot, watching the scene in silence. Finally, he spoke, almost to himself: "This is the reality of war." The realization sank in: America could supply its war machine forever, while Germany, despite its once proud military industry, could never compete at this scale. The Germans had been fighting a war of attrition, but America had turned that on its head. With the power of production, the war had already been won. And here's the truth: if you walk away now, ignoring how America's industrial might reshaped the course of history, you'll never fully understand what really decided the outcome of World War II. Machines didn't just win the war, they built it. If you're not paying attention, you're missing the biggest story of the war. Subscribe now, because understanding America's industrial might is key to understanding how it changed the world forever. The final days of the war were drawing near, but the German POWs had already begun to understand the most crucial truth: America's power didn't just lie in its soldiers or its leaders, it was in its ability to produce. It had been a lesson they could not ignore. Each moment spent in the factories, each day spent watching the endless lines of tanks, planes, and vehicles being assembled with unstoppable precision, left a permanent mark on their minds. They knew they could never go back to the world they had once known. America had changed the rules of warfare. As the POWs prepared to return to their camps in Europe, many of them couldn't shake the images of what they had seen. The constant hum of machines, the synchronized rhythm of workers and factories, the seemingly infinite output of weapons and vehicles, they were all embedded in their minds. There was no doubt now. America's industrial might was the true force behind the Allied victory. It wasn't just about the machines themselves, it was about the system that made them work. The American factories were built on a philosophy of continuous production, endless output, and unmatched efficiency. It was a system that didn't just create weapons, it created a new world order. The Germans, no matter how skilled or strategic, had been fighting a war where their resources and manpower were finite. America had built a system that was built to last, built to win. For the German engineers, the ones who had worked on aircraft and tanks, the realization was bitter. They had spent years crafting designs, refining engines, and trying to outmaneuver the enemy with limited resources. But what they saw in America was unlike anything they had ever imagined. The Americans didn't just design machines, they designed systems that could churn out endless numbers of them. The efficiency, the scale, the speed, they were working with an industrial base that no one could match. They didn't just build planes. They built the system that could make thousands of them, one engineer said, sitting quietly in the barracks, lost in thought. It was an epiphany, but also a defeat. He realized that the war was never about tactics or technology, it was about the power of production. America had a system that could sustain itself, never running out of material, never running out of capacity. And it wasn't just the weapons, it was the mindset that fueled it. In Germany, the war was always a struggle for scarcity. In America, it was a struggle for abundance. One of the younger POWs, a pilot who had once believed that flying skill was the key to victory, now stood in the shadow of an American bomber that had just rolled off the production line. He ran his hand along its sleek, polished surface, and for the first time, he began to understand. It wasn't just about the fighter planes or the battleships, he thought. It was about the ability to produce more of them than the enemy could ever hope to stop. The bomber in front of him was a symbol, not just of military power, but of an entire industrial ecosystem that could churn out these machines faster than any air force could counter. The B-24, the B-17, the Sherman tank, these machines weren't just tools of war, they were symbols of America's ability to outproduce and outlast the Axis powers. The German pilot thought back to the last aerial dogfight he had been in, how his Zero had been overpowered, how the Mustangs had circled them with impunity. And now he realized, it wasn't just that the American fighters were better, it was that they were everywhere, backed by a system that could replace them faster than they could be shot down. The American war machine was unstoppable because it was never running out of resources, never running out of equipment, and never losing momentum. The months that followed their return to Germany were filled with reflection. As the war came to its inevitable conclusion, the German POWs could do nothing but acknowledge the truth that had sunk deep into their hearts during their time in America. The Allies had won because they had a system that allowed them to produce war materials in unimaginable quantities. The German prisoners had seen it with their own eyes. It wasn't just the size of the factories, but the rhythmic, relentless efficiency that America had cultivated. It was a system that could never be matched by a nation struggling with limited resources and constant bombing. Many of the POWs returned home and resumed their work in the devastated factories of post-war Germany. But they never forgot the lessons they had learned on American soil. As they walked through the ruined streets, witnessing the remnants of the once proud German war machine, they realized that they had missed the key to the war. They had been playing a game of attrition while the Americans had been playing a game of production. The legacy of what the German POWs had witnessed would continue to shape their understanding of the world long after the war ended. Many of them would spend years trying to rebuild what had been lost. But deep down, they knew that Germany could never compete with the industrial strength that America had brought to the battlefield. They had fought with everything they had, but it was never enough. The Germans had always believed that their engineering superiority would lead them to victory. But America had shown them that power in war wasn't just about genius, it was about the ability to sustain it, to outproduce and outlast the enemy. It was about the machines. And America had perfected the art of machine warfare. The truth of this realization stayed with the POWs long after the war ended. Some of them returned to their old lives, trying to rebuild their country from the ashes of defeat. Others stayed in America, struggling with the truth they had learned. The war had been decided not by superior tactics, but by superior production. America's industrial might had shaped the outcome of the war, and in doing so, it had reshaped the world. The Germans who had witnessed this firsthand were haunted by the realization that this new era of war was defined not by what could be built, but by what could be produced. And here's the truth: if you turn away now, if you don't grasp the scale of what America's industrial power meant, you're missing the defining factor of the war. The factories, the machines, they won the war. Subscribe now to understand how America's production power changed the face of global warfare and how it continues to shape the world today.